Hello, hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Nadia Jordana, and you're watching Talk to the Author. My guest today is Bryce Stenzel. He's an accomplished author of several books, at least one about the history of Mankato, Minnesota, but also several books, historical books about the life and times of Abraham Lincoln, and that fascinates me. So let's not hang around here. Let's go talk to Bryce and learn more. Welcome to the show, Bryce.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
And I'm so excited to hear about the books that you've been writing. First, though, let me ask, are you a native of Mankato, Minnesota?
Yes, I am. I was born in Mankato, actually in March of 1967. So I'm coming up on my 55th birthday here in a month. But I don't feel that I'm over the hill, so to speak. I feel better now in my 50s than I did in my 40s. So I guess 55 is the new 40.
55 is the new 35.
There you go. I like that even better.
I like that. Well, Bryce, you've written historical books, at least one about the city of Mankato, Minnesota, and a number about the life and times of Abraham Lincoln, a subject I've been interested in all my life. I actually liked history in school, unlike a lot of my schoolmates. So tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got to writing these books.
Well, that's true for me as well. I've always enjoyed history from the time I was a little boy, and I think part of that has to do with my family. I come from a family of storytellers. My grandparents were good storytellers, and so I'd sit around and listen to them. My parents were good storytellers. They grew up during the Depression, so they had a lot of stories. I mean, some of them were not the most pleasant situations to be in, but they make for good stories. My father was a World War II combat veteran. He fought in the South Pacific, actually fought at the Battle of Guadalcanal, which was actually the turning point of World War II in the Pacific. Because prior to that, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, of course, and then we had Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea. But Guadalcanal was actually the first land offensive. I did some research in college to find out more about this battle that my dad was in, and it was a horrible ordeal. War is ugly, or as Sherman said, war is hell. But that's certainly true. My dad came back with many battle scars. In fact, some were physical, some were mental. He had the post-traumatic stress syndrome, as many soldiers did, but of course they didn't know much about it in those days. But as far as a physical scar, he actually was shot in the side during the Battle of Guadalcanal, and actually you could still see the scar. He lost some ribs. And even as children, when my sister and I were, roughhousing with him a little bit, like dads often do, or we were swimming, we had to be careful not to, he was very, very careful. If you didn't know him, you wouldn't know it. But those of us that did, that he was kind of protecting that where those ribs were missing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he came back with some battle scars. Now that ties into my future career, because he taught me patriotism from a very young age, how to respect the American flag, the heroes of various conflicts. When I was about 10, 11 years old, he gave me a flag that I still have in my personal collection. In fact, I've taken it to a number of historic sites. I've taken it to Lincoln's home, where it was flown over Lincoln's home. The National Park Service, does these favors for their visitors. And when I told them where it came from, they flew the flag over Lincoln's home. I've taken it to Gettysburg. I didn't fly it there. I just kept it folded. But I do have a photo where I'm with some other Lincoln presenters, and I'm holding this flag. It's the same one that my dad gave me when I was about 11 years old. But as a boy, I was looking for heroes. I was looking for, as many young children do. And of course, my dad was a hero. But beyond that, I gravitated to Lincoln as a young age because I saw, I think, many of the same characteristics. That love of country, that belief that all men are created equal. My dad also gave me a parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, I couldn't read it very well, but it was something that he picked up around the 4th of July and gave it to me. And that fascinated me. And then as I got older, of course, I looked into what it actually said and what it meant. And then when I started reading about Lincoln, there's many references Lincoln made to the Declaration of Independence. So that's how it kind of all ties together. As far as Mankato has a very rich history. The community started in 1852, actually February of 1852. Two men from St. Paul actually came up the Minnesota River and were going to establish a town site, which they did. And that grew into the city of Mankato. They were actually storekeepers. And so they were trying to start a business type community. Mankato is best known, unfortunately, for a horrible incident that happened in 1862. This would be 10 years later during the Civil War. And again, there's a Lincoln connection here. But it involved the execution of the 38 Dakota, which is still the largest mass execution in American history. But it would have been far, far worse had President Lincoln not intervened directly and ended up pardoning. There's supposed to be 303 sentenced to be executed, and Lincoln pardoned all but 38. And sometimes the historical revisionists have gotten a hold of this in recent years. All we hear about is the 38 plus 2 that were hanged. And I always say, what about the 265 that he pardoned? And if you understand Lincoln's background, it's all the more unique because Lincoln's own grandfather was killed by Indians in Kentucky. I mean, you would think he'd have those prejudices, carry forward as many families do, but no, he didn't. He was a humanitarian and he judged each case individually. And you saw that in this incident. Of course, Lincoln was an attorney, but he actually took the time to review each and every one of those convictions. And I think he did the best he could in a very traumatic situation. I've actually written a book on that. That's one of the books that I have. It's called "We Cannot Escape History: Abraham Lincoln's Trials by Fire," and it's a play on words.
We can learn a lot from history.
Absolutely. And I'll save one more story to the end. You asked for an interesting story about Mankato. I'll save that one for the end, but that's just to get us started.
Great, save that. Yeah, we'll come back to that. We won't go away without hearing that story. And another thing I was wondering is you being a very busy man and a career in education, I understand, but also your activities in the community. Tell us about some of those things.
Well, as I said, I am a native of Mankato. I grew up in this community, so it's always been important to me. I graduated from the university, actually Minnesota State, Mankato, in 1990 and again in 1995. So I earned my bachelor in teaching degree in history, social studies. No surprise there, I guess. And then I went on and got a master's degree also in history. And that's what allowed me to, learn how to do a lot of we did some research as undergraduates, but you really get into the researching and the writing as a graduate student. That's been pretty helpful to me in researching, these topics for my various books that I've written.
Did you, I imagine English was a strong subject for you. Did you use those skills to, well, what I'm thinking about is there's so many books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, especially, that it's got to be an effort and a way you could use all of your skills that you learned through school and through English and your skills in writing to make it fresh and new and fascinating still to the readers.
Well, and for that, I have to thank my mother, her influence. My dad taught me patriotism and the interest, the subject matter is certainly derived from him, but actually the skill as a writer. My mother was a very good writer. She used to write her own letters, which many people did in her day. She wouldn't have thought anything of it, but today that's kind of a lost art. Sitting down writing your own letters. This was in the days before. I mean, she was a typist. Also, she worked as a legal secretary for a number of years before she got married and then became a full-time mom. But she was actually very good with penmanship. In fact, she had a handwriting certificate, which I still have. My mother passed away a number of years ago. Actually, both my parents are gone now, but I have her handwriting certificate. She went to the Minneapolis business school for writing and actually got a handwriting certificate. I don't think they even do that anymore. But in fact, for a long time, they weren't teaching penmanship, what we call cursive writing. They weren't teaching that in schools at all anymore. Now I'm happy to see that it's coming back. In fact, I was working with a group of third graders yesterday, and they were actually practicing their spelling words, but they had to write it. First, they had to print it, and then they had to write it in cursive. So they're relearning what was a lost art there for a while.
I'm glad for that.
But no, my mother, her influence taught me to write, and to the point where I can write my own books, so on. She also told me, you're going to take typing and you're going to learn how to do it, when I was in high school. And of course, I argued with her, what teenage boy wouldn't, because in those days that was supposed to be just for girls. And she says, I don't care. You're going to learn how to type because you're going to need to know this skill. Well, I protested all I wanted, but yeah, I still took it. And I'm grateful that I did, because now all of my research papers, my books, everything, or the manuscripts for my books, I type all that myself. I've saved a lot of money over the years by doing that. I'm not the fastest typist in the world, but who cares?
Yeah, absolutely. And you portray Abraham Lincoln. Tell us about the circumstances around that. When and where and how do you do that?
I started that actually, well, as I said, I've always been interested in him from the time I was a little boy, but actually the costume historical interpretation began in high school. I was getting ready for, well, first there was the senior prom. So that was the first step. And I needed a tuxedo. Well, it just so happened that my aunt in Minneapolis, who by the way lived on Lincoln Street, makes a nice story. Anyway, she had a tuxedo, one of the with the tails and everything, that had belonged to my uncle, who was in the Minneapolis Orchestra, which is now the Minnesota Symphony, at any rate, or the Minnesota Orchestra. At any rate, she had this tuxedo still hanging in her closet, and it's like, well, I'm never going to use it. No one else in the family is going to use it. I needed a tuxedo for the senior prom. She said, why rent one, if it fits? Well, my sister, who's actually very good with sewing, did some tailoring on it, and yeah, it looked pretty good when we got all done. Somebody told me at the senior prom, "Oh, you resemble Lincoln." You just, I didn't even have the beard at that point. But at any rate, I thought about that, and the following summer after I graduated, I was in the marching band, and we took a trip to Washington D.C. and we were all supposed to dress as historical characters. Well, I got a hold of a artificial beard at that point. We shaped it and everything, and then I wore this tuxedo, and I won the costume judging for that. So out of that, then then I kind of put it aside for a while. But when I was doing my undergraduate work, actually getting ready. It was close to graduation, but one of the requirements was, even though I'm licensed to teach secondary, we were supposed to observe, and I'm really glad they did this. I think this was one of the highlights of my entire college career, because I still work in the elementary sector, even though, as I said, I was working with third graders the other day. I still work with elementary students, even though technically I'm licensed for, well, like now it's 5 through 12. But they wanted us to have this observation to see the progression from elementary to middle to senior high students. And so I wanted to participate in that, and it just happened that the elementary observation was for February 12th. It was actually February 12th of 1990, which of course was Lincoln's birthday. And we were all supposed to have a lesson plan. In addition to observing, we were supposed to have something that we could teach. So I taught them a lesson on Abraham Lincoln as Abraham Lincoln, dressed up in this outfit that I had. And you could say the rest is history. I've been doing it ever since, for 30 years. 30 plus years. It's actually 32 years now.
Everybody loves to see it too, I'm sure. Well, now we just have enough time to hear that interesting story about Mankato.
Yes, I have one where I'm standing. Well, you'll see the sign. It says Gettysburg National Cemetery, but I'm standing outside the cemetery where Lincoln gave those immortal 272 words, the Gettysburg Address, in November of 1863. One of the more recent trips I took to Gettysburg was I got all dressed up and had that picture taken. But the story I was going to share about Mankato was, we all know about Lincoln's assassination, which took place the 14th of April, 1865. And we know that he was running a bit late to the theater that night, but you may not know why he was running late. The reason for it was he had some last minute visitors that came to see him. And the very last person that he was talking to was a gentleman by the name of Schuyler Colfax, who was the Speaker of the House at the time. In fact, if you watch the Lincoln movie, they show him as part of the vote for the 13th Amendment. The problem is the movie's great. The Spielberg Lincoln movie's wonderful, except the gentleman they have playing Schuyler Colfax is too old. He was a younger man at that point than the way he's depicted in the movie, but that's beside the point. Schuyler Colfax he'd come earlier in the day to talk to Lincoln, and then he came back. And from all accounts, Schuyler Colfax was a talker. He liked to talk, he liked to visit. But the reason he was there, he was actually there on business, because he was leaving for California the following day. This would have been the 15th of April. He was making a trip out west, and Lincoln wanted him to actually take a speech along that Lincoln had prepared to the miners of California and Nevada. So he was going through where the Comstock lode was, and then out into the Goldfield area of California. Well, California and Nevada both had contributed mightily to the Union war effort in terms of money, the gold and the silver. That's what financed largely the Union war effort. And so Lincoln wanted these miners to know how much he personally appreciated their efforts. And so he was going to send this along with the Speaker of the House, who was traveling west anyway. Okay, well, Schuyler Colfax came and talked to Lincoln and then made him late to the theater. But the point is, he was the last person to see Lincoln before Lincoln left the White House. 20 years later, Schuyler Colfax was taking another railroad trip, and he happened to pass through Mankato on his way. He was actually taking another, he liked to travel by train. And of course, by 20 years later, they had much more miles of a railroad track that he could than what they had 20 years earlier. At any rate, he passed through Mankato on his way, and Schuyler Colfax suffered a heart attack and died. He died actually in the waiting room changing trains from one waiting room to the other. He had to walk, it was about a half a mile. This was the 13th of January, 1885. So it's very, very cold, below zero, very similar to what we've been experiencing here recently. And he was all bundled up in his overcoats and everything. In fact, a lot of people didn't even know who he was. But he sat down on the bench, suffered the heart attack, kind of leaned over and died. And then his train came and went, and he wasn't on it. And finally they realized, oh, Mr. Colfax, he's not there. That railroad station is across the street from where the hospital was that I was born in. So that ties together, because the last person to see Lincoln alive died where I was born.
How interesting. Well,
Well,
thank you, Bryce, for all this fascinating information about you and your books and the history. And thank you all for watching today. We'll see you next time on Talk to the Author.
Thank you.